Hello, and welcome to History at Bedtime. The Ottoman Empire did not begin as an empire. It began as a frontier opportunity, a small principality on the edge of a weakened Byzantine world, led by a dynasty whose first followers were not yet administrators of continents, but writers, raiders, preachers, traders, converts, captives, and ambitious men who understood that the old order of Anatolia was breaking apart. That is what makes the Ottoman story so powerful. It is not only the story of conquest. It is the story of a political machine that learned how to survive. It began with Osman in the hills of northwestern Anatolia. It reached Constantinople, the city that had once been the heart of the Roman world. It crossed the Balkans, ruled the Arab provinces, challenged Vienna, guarded the holy cities of Islam, controlled the eastern Mediterranean, and left traces from Sarajevo to Cairo, from Damascus to Budapest, from Algiers to Baghdad. For 6 centuries, the Ottomans governed a world of extraordinary diversity. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Arabs, Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, Kurds, Albanians, Jews of Spain, merchants of Venice, scholars of Cairo, soldiers of the Balkans, women of the imperial household, judges, scribes, cooks, sailors, architects, rebels, reformers, all moved inside an imperial structure that could be practical, brilliant, harsh, flexible, hierarchical, tolerant in some contexts, brutal in others, and often more complicated than the simple labels later attached to it. The question is not only how the Ottomans conquered. The deeper question is how they endured. Armies can win battles for a generation. Empires survive for centuries only when they learn how to tax, negotiate, reward, terrify, incorporate, build, repair, and adapt. The Ottoman Empire did all of these things, not perfectly and not forever, but with enough intelligence to become one of the defining powers of the early modern world. To understand it, we begin not with the domes of Istanbul or the armies before Vienna, but with a broken frontier, a collapsing Byzantine borderland, and a small house of warriors whose name the world would eventually know as Ottoman, long before anyone could imagine the scale of what it would become. Around the year 1299, a small frontier chieftain in northwestern Anatolia declared himself ruler of an independent principality. His name was Osman. He controlled perhaps a few thousand square kilometers of territory, a handful of towns, and an army small enough that the great powers of the region barely noticed his existence. 600 years later, the political entity that bore his name, the Ottoman Empire, had become one of the most powerful, most durable, and most geographically extensive states in the history of the world. At its peak, it controlled territory across 3 continents, governed more than 30 million people, and commanded an administration, a military, and a legal system of formidable sophistication. The first thing to understand is that the Ottomans did not rise because everyone around them was weak and they were simply strong. They rose because they were unusually good at using instability. A broken frontier gave them room. Byzantine decline gave them targets. Mongol disruption created political fragments across Anatolia. Religious language gave their warriors meaning. Trade routes gave their towns wealth. Captured cities gave them administrators, craftsmen, and tax systems. Each success gave them new tools for the next success. The Ottoman state grew by turning the debris of older worlds into the structure of a new one. That ability to convert crisis into order repeatedly and under pressure is the thread that runs through the entire Ottoman story. Osman's principality was one of these beyliks, positioned in the northwestern corner of Anatolia, where the Byzantine frontier was closest and most accessible. This positioning was significant in ways that would prove decisive for his dynasty's growth. The frontier with Byzantium was not simply a military boundary. It was a zone of contact, of trade, of population movement, of religious ambiguity. Men of many backgrounds settled on the frontier: Turkish nomads from the Anatolian interior, Muslim religious figures seeking to spread their faith, Christian farmers and merchants of Byzantine heritage, adventurers from across the Islamic world drawn by the promise of action and potential wealth. This mixed, fluid frontier population was the human material from which Osman and his successors built their state. The concept of the Ghazi, the warrior for the faith, the fighter on the frontier between the Islamic and Christian worlds, was central to the early Ottoman self-presentation and to the ideology that attracted followers to Osman's banner. The Ghazi tradition was not simply about religious warfare in a narrow sense. It was about participation in a frontier society of shared purpose, shared danger, and shared reward. Men who joined the Ghazi bands on the Byzantine frontier were joining a community that offered adventure, the possibility of wealth through conquest, and a sense of religious and social identity that transcended their specific origins. The early Ottoman state was built on the loyalty of this diverse frontier community and the Ottoman capacity to attract and retain talent of diverse backgrounds, which would remain one of the dynasty's most distinctive and most powerful characteristics throughout its history, was already visible in these early decades. The early Ottoman world should not be imagined as a neat state with fixed borders and a single identity. It was closer to a moving coalition. A man might join because he wanted plunder, or land, or honor, or religious merit, or protection from stronger neighbors. A village might submit because Ottoman tax collectors were predictable, or because the Byzantine authorities had become distant and ineffective, or because local elites saw an advantage in changing allegiance. A Christian cavalryman might continue to hold land under an Ottoman ruler. A Muslim frontier warrior might marry into a Christian local family. A dervish might found a lodge that became a center of settlement, hospitality, and loyalty. The frontier was not clean. It was fluid, and that fluidity was one of the sources of Ottoman strength. This matters because later Ottoman power was built on incorporation more than on purity. The dynasty did not grow by insisting that everyone become the same. It grew by making different people useful inside the same political order. In the early period, that meant absorbing Byzantine fortresses, local notables, Muslim Ghazis, Greek-speaking villagers, Turkish nomads, and religious networks into a frontier principality that could move faster than the exhausted states around it. The Ottomans were not the largest beylik in Anatolia at the beginning. They were not the oldest or the most prestigious, but they were placed in the right frontier zone, and they developed the habit that would define their future. They turned contact into power. Osman died around 1323, and the principality passed to his son Orhan. Under Orhan, the Ottomans captured the important Byzantine city of Bursa in 1326, which became their first major urban center and their first capital. The capture of Bursa was a significant step. It gave the Ottomans a city with an existing administrative apparatus, a mercantile economy, and a position on major trade routes, transforming the principality from a tribal military organization into something beginning to resemble a state. Orhan began building the administrative structures, regularized tax systems, organized military units, institutions of Islamic law and scholarship that would be elaborated and extended by his successors. The Ottoman expansion into Europe began under Orhan's son Murad I. A small Ottoman force had crossed the Dardanelles into Thrace as early as 1352, but Murad's systematic campaigns established Ottoman control over Thrace and Macedon and began the long process of making the Ottomans the dominant power in the Balkans. The city of Edirne, Adrianople to the Byzantines, fell to the Ottomans around 1369 and became the new Ottoman capital, reflecting the shift of the empire's center of gravity toward Europe. The early Ottoman incorporation of the Balkans was not simply a story of military conquest and displacement. The Ottoman system demonstrated from an early stage a characteristic capacity for accommodation and incorporation that distinguished it from purely extractive or destructive models of expansion. Local Christian nobility who submitted to Ottoman authority were often retained in their positions. Their landholding arrangements continued. Their populations left largely undisturbed as long as taxes were paid and military cooperation was provided. Over time, the Christian communities of the Balkans, Bulgarian, Greek, Serbian, Romanian, were organized within what became the millet system, which allowed them to maintain their own religious and legal institutions under the authority of their own religious leaders, who were in turn responsible to the Ottoman state for the behavior and the tax contributions of their communities. This system, the management of religious diversity through institutionalized communal autonomy, was one of the Ottoman Empire's most distinctive features and one of its most enduring practical achievements. It was not tolerance in the modern liberal sense, which carries the implication of equality of status and freedom of conscience. What later became known as the millet system was hierarchical, with the Ottoman Muslim community at the top and non-Muslim communities in a subordinate but protected position. Non-Muslims paid additional taxes, the jizya, or poll tax, that Muslims did not. Non-Muslims were excluded from certain military and administrative positions. But within their own communities, the Christian and Jewish populations of the Ottoman Empire retained a degree of institutional autonomy that had no parallel in most contemporary European states, where religious uniformity was being enforced with increasing ruthlessness and minority communities faced systematic persecution. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389 was the critical military engagement that established Ottoman dominance in the Balkans, though the battle was not the decisive Ottoman victory that later tradition made it. Murad I was killed during or immediately after the battle. The circumstances remain uncertain, and his son Bayezid I, who assumed command and pursued the scattered Serbian forces, completed the effective subjugation of Serbia. The battle entered Serbian historical memory as a tragedy of mythological dimensions, the moment at which the Serbian medieval kingdom was broken, and it has remained a live political and cultural reference point for Serbian identity into the present day in ways that have periodically resurfaced in the politics of the region. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, under Sultan Mehmed II, was one of the most consequential single events in medieval history, a moment that contemporary observers across the Christian and Muslim worlds understood to be a turning point of the First Order, and that subsequent historians have consistently confirmed in their assessment. Constantinople had been the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for more than 1100 years, the center of Orthodox Christian civilization, the city that more than any other single place embodied the continuity between the ancient world and the medieval. Its fall to the Ottomans was experienced across the Christian world as a catastrophe, and it sent Greek scholars and manuscripts fleeing west to Italy in ways that contributed directly to the Italian Renaissance. The dynasty nearly lost everything within a generation of Kosovo. Bayezid I, Murad's son, was a formidable ruler, fast-moving and ambitious enough to earn the nickname Yildirim, the Thunderbolt. He pressed deeper into the Balkans, tightened Ottoman pressure around Constantinople, and seemed to be pushing the state toward full imperial status before the 15th century had even begun. But his speed brought him into collision with a power even more devastating than his own. In 1402, at the Battle of Ankara, Bayezid faced Timur, the Turco-Mongol conqueror whose armies had already ravaged Persia, Iraq, Syria, and Central Asia. Bayezid was defeated and captured. The Ottoman state fractured almost immediately. The years after Ankara are known as the Ottoman Interregnum. Bayezid's sons fought one another for control, each claiming legitimacy, each seeking support from different regional powers. For many dynasties, this would have been the end. a young state shattered by a world conqueror, its ruler captured, its princes fighting, its enemies watching. Such states usually disappear. The fact that the Ottomans did not disappear is one of the most important facts in their history. Mehmed I eventually reunited the dynasty, and Murad II restored its military authority. The lesson was harsh but formative. The Ottoman project could be interrupted, wounded, even humiliated, but it had already developed enough institutional depth to recover. This recovery changed the character of the state. The Ottomans emerged from the interregnum with a sharper awareness of succession, legitimacy, and military discipline. They understood that conquest alone was not enough. A dynasty had to survive its own internal rivalries. A frontier principality could live on charisma and opportunity. An empire required systems. For the Ottomans, the capture of Constantinople was equally transformative. Mehmed II, who was 21 years old at the time of the conquest, who had spent years preparing for it, who had commissioned enormous bronze cannons that finally breached the ancient Theodosian walls after a 53-day siege, did not simply acquire a city. He acquired a capital, an imperial heritage, and a claim to a form of universal sovereignty that the Byzantine rulers had exercised. He moved the Ottoman capital to Constantinople, which his subjects would call by various names, most commonly Istanbul, from the Greek phrase Istanbul, meaning into the city, and began immediately to rebuild and repopulate it, inviting craftsmen and scholars and merchants from across the empire and beyond to settle there. Mehmed understood himself, after Constantinople, as something more than a Turkish sultan. He was now the heir of Rome, the emperor of a universal empire, a figure whose authority transcended any single ethnic or religious community. He patronized Greek scholars, studied Greek and Latin alongside Turkish and Arabic and Persian, collected ancient manuscripts, and commissioned a portrait from the Venetian painter Gentile Bellini, an act that had no precedent in Ottoman royal practice and that reflected his genuine engagement with the European Renaissance alongside the Islamic and Byzantine traditions he was simultaneously inheriting. The portrait of Mehmed by Bellini, now in the National Gallery in London, shows a face of remarkable intelligence and apparent introspection, a man who understood himself to be living at a historical hinge point and was interested in everything that moment brought within reach. The city that Mehmed rebuilt, and that his successors continued to develop across the following centuries, became one of the great cities of the world. The Hagia Sophia, the great church built by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century and considered the supreme achievement of Byzantine architecture, was converted to a mosque and became the central religious monument of the Ottoman capital. The Topkapi Palace, built on the promontory overlooking the Golden Horn and the Bosphorus, became the administrative and residential center of the empire, a complex that grew over the centuries into an enormous architectural accumulation of courtyards and pavilions and libraries and kitchens and stables, housing not only the Sultan and his household, but the entire central apparatus of Ottoman governance. Rebuilding Constantinople was as important as taking it. A conquered city can become a ruin. Mehmed wanted a capital. He needed population, workshops, markets, religious institutions, and the daily activity that makes imperial authority visible not only in palace ceremonies, but in bread ovens, tax offices, caravanserais, schools, and docks. He resettled Muslims, Christians, and Jews from different parts of the empire, sometimes voluntarily and sometimes by command. He restored the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate under Ottoman authority, encouraged Armenian and Jewish communities, and turned the city into a managed mosaic of populations. This was not sentimentality. It was statecraft. A city like Constantinople could not function as the capital of a multi-confessional empire if it were reduced to one community. The Ottoman capital became great because it was plural. Turkish-speaking soldiers, Greek merchants, Armenian craftsmen, Jewish physicians, Arab scholars, Balkan converts, Persian poets, Venetian envoys, and slaves of the palace all moved through the same urban world. The empire's diversity was not an accidental background. It was a resource the state learned to organize. In the decades after the conquest, the city slowly became Istanbul in practice, even while official and foreign names varied. Mosques rose beside former churches. Markets returned. The palace took shape. The harbor filled again. A city that had been the capital of Christian Rome became the capital of a Muslim empire without entirely ceasing to carry the memory of what it had been before. That layered identity is still part of Istanbul's power today. The view from Topkapi across the Bosphorus toward Asia, the meeting point of two continents visible from a single vantage point, is one of the most remarkable views in the world, and it was not accidental that the Ottoman rulers chose this spot for their primary residence. The position between Europe and Asia was not simply geographical. It was symbolic, a constant visual reminder of the empire's bridging function, its identity as a state that was genuinely neither entirely European nor entirely Asian, but something that comprehended both. The 16th century was the period of the Ottoman Empire's greatest power and greatest extent, and it produced the figure who is still the best-known Ottoman Sultan in the Western world. Suleiman, called Kanuni, the lawgiver, by his own subjects, and called the Magnificent by the Europeans who feared and admired him, came to the throne in 1520 and ruled for 46 years, the longest reign of any Ottoman Sultan. During those 46 years, he personally led 13 major military campaigns, extended Ottoman territory to its greatest extent, and oversaw an elaboration of Ottoman law, literature, architecture, and administrative practice that defined the high point of the imperial tradition. Before Suleiman came his father, Selim I, whose short reign changed the empire's geography and religious identity with extraordinary speed. Selim defeated the Safavids at Calderon in 1514, checked the westward expansion of a Shia imperial rival, and then turned south against the Mamluk Sultanate. In 1516 and 1517, Ottoman armies defeated the Mamluks and absorbed Syria, Egypt, and the Hijaz into the empire. This brought Cairo, Damascus, Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina under Ottoman sovereignty. It also transformed the Sultan from a powerful frontier monarch into the protector of the holy cities of Islam and the ruler of the central lands of the Arabic-speaking Islamic world. The conquest of Egypt mattered economically as much as spiritually. Egypt controlled immense agricultural wealth, tax revenue, and the grain routes of the eastern Mediterranean. Cairo was one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the Islamic world. The Red Sea routes connected the empire to the Indian Ocean and to the spice trade that Portuguese ships were trying to dominate by sea. Selim's conquests gave the Ottomans both prestige and pressure. They now ruled lands older, wealthier, and more administratively complex than the Anatolian and Balkan core from which they had risen. Suleiman inherited this expanded world. His magnificence did not appear from nowhere. It rested on a state enlarged by his predecessors, especially by the conquests of Mehmed and Selim. What made Suleiman's reign extraordinary was that he converted this inheritance into a mature imperial style: military power, law, architecture, literature, ceremony, and administration, all reaching a level of confidence that later generations would look back on as the classical Ottoman age. Suleiman's military achievements were formidable. He captured Belgrade in 1521, removing the last major barrier to Ottoman expansion into the heart of Europe. He defeated and killed the King of Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, and Hungary became an Ottoman tributary. He besieged Vienna in 1529, the furthest west that any Ottoman army would ever penetrate, and though the siege failed after 3 weeks, the fear it produced in the courts of Europe shaped continental politics for decades. In the east, he defeated the Safavid Persians and extended Ottoman control over Iraq, including Baghdad and the Shia holy cities of Najaf and Karbala. In the south, he added Aden and large portions of the Arabian coast, and Ottoman power in the western Indian Ocean challenged Portuguese commercial dominance of the spice trade. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 has often been treated in European memory as a clash of civilizations. But for the Ottomans, it was also part of a specific struggle over Hungary and the Habsburg claim to dominate Central Europe. The army reached Vienna after difficult weather, long supply lines, and the usual strain of moving a vast imperial force across distance. The siege failed, not because Ottoman ambition had vanished, but because geography, logistics, weather, and the limits of campaigning seasons still mattered even to one of the strongest armies in the world. The failure did not end Ottoman power. It defined its western limit. What is easy to miss is that Ottoman warfare was not only battlefield drama. It was administration in motion. Roads had to be cleared. Bridges had to be built. Grain had to be purchased or requisitioned. Animals had to be fed. Artillery had to be transported. Engineers, surveyors, scribes, judges, and treasurers moved with armies. A campaign was a temporary city stretched across the landscape, and its success depended on the ability of the central government to command men and material from provinces thousands of kilometers apart. The Ottoman military machine at its height was terrifying not because its soldiers were uniquely brave, though many were brave, but because the empire could organize movement on a continental scale. The administration of this enormous empire required an apparatus of considerable sophistication, and Suleiman's reign saw the development of the canon, the sultanic law, that complemented and in some areas superseded the Sharia, the Islamic law. The canon system allowed the Ottoman state to regulate areas of commercial, administrative, and criminal law where the Sharia was silent or where consistent statewide standards were needed that the more locally variable Sharia could not easily provide. The codification of the canon under Suleiman was the reason his subjects called him the lawgiver, not because he invented the legal system, but because he organized and systematized it in ways that gave the empire a more coherent legal foundation than it had previously possessed. The Ottoman legal order rested on a careful balance. Islamic law provided a sacred and scholarly framework, interpreted by judges and jurists trained in the Madris tradition. Sultanic law, the canon, provided the state's practical regulations concerning taxation, landholding, criminal penalties, markets, and administration. Customary practice, local negotiation, and imperial decree all interacted with these systems. This made the legal world complex, but it also made it adaptable. In many provinces, especially newly conquered ones, the Ottomans did not simply erase existing arrangements. They surveyed land, recorded households, classified revenue sources, and often preserved local practices where those practices served state stability. The famous Tahrir defters, the tax registers, were instruments of power but also sources of astonishing administrative detail. Villages, fields, mills, vineyards, households, widows, bachelors, religious communities, taxable production. They reveal an empire deeply interested in knowing what it ruled. Knowledge produced revenue. Revenue supported cavalrymen, judges, roads, armies, kitchens, and mosques. The empire's grandeur rested on paperwork as much as on swords. The architecture of Suleiman's reign is its most immediately tangible legacy. The royal architect Sinan, who served under Suleiman and his successors for nearly half a century and who designed more than 300 structures across the empire, was one of the greatest architects in the history of the world, a figure comparable in his influence on the built environment to Michelangelo or Brunelleschi, and arguably more prolific than either. He began his career as a military engineer, participated in the campaigns that extended Ottoman power across the Mediterranean, and brought to his architectural practice the systematic, problem-solving intelligence of an engineer alongside the aesthetic sensibility of an artist trained in one of the richest visual traditions in the world. Sinan's importance is not only that he built beautiful mosques. It is that he gave the Ottoman Empire an architectural language equal to its political ambition. Byzantine architecture had given the city the dome of Hagia Sophia, a vast interior space that seemed to hover between earth and heaven. Ottoman architects inherited that challenge and made it their own. They did not merely copy Hagia Sophia. They studied it, answered it, corrected it, and eventually produced spaces that felt unmistakably Ottoman, centralized, luminous, disciplined, and open. The mosque complex, or Kulai, expressed a particular Ottoman understanding of civilization. Worship was at the center, but it was surrounded by education, feeding, healing, washing, lodging, and charity. A great mosque was not only a sacred building, it was an urban organism. It organized neighborhoods. It employed workers. It fed the poor. It taught students. It gave water to travelers. It buried rulers. It marked the skyline so that the power of the dynasty could be read from a distance, but it also handled ordinary human needs at ground level. This combination of majesty and service is one of the reasons Ottoman architecture remains so powerful. It does not separate glory from function. It binds them together. His masterpiece, the Suleiman Mosque in Edirne, completed in 1574 when Sinan was in his 80s, is considered by many architectural historians to be the supreme achievement of Ottoman architecture and one of the supreme achievements of world architecture. Its central dome, slightly larger than that of the Hagia Sophia that had inspired and challenged Ottoman architects for a century, floats above a space of extraordinary lightness and clarity, supported by 8 massive piers set far enough back from the center to allow an unobstructed floor space unusual in mosques of this scale. The 4 pencil-thin minarets that rise at the corners are among the most elegant architectural elements in the Ottoman tradition. Sinan himself reportedly said that the Selimi was his masterpiece, the work in which he had finally solved the structural and aesthetic problems he had been working on throughout his career. The Suleimani complex in Istanbul, the greatest of the imperial mosque complexes built during Suleiman's reign, housing not only the mosque itself, but a hospital, schools, a bathhouse, soup kitchens, and Suleiman's own tomb, gives the best sense of how the Ottomans understood the relationship between religious architecture and social function. The mosque was not simply a place of worship. It was the center of a complex of institutions that served the wider community, feeding the poor, educating the young, caring for the sick, all of this organized and funded through the Waqf system, the Islamic institution of the charitable endowment, which allowed the revenues of dedicated property to support religious and charitable purposes in perpetuity. The Waqf system was one of the Ottoman Empire's most important social institutions, and it shaped the physical landscape of Ottoman cities more than almost any other single factor. A wealthy individual, a sultan, a vizier, a merchant, or even a relatively modest member of the middle class could dedicate property to the support of a religious or charitable institution, creating a legally permanent endowment that would fund that institution for as long as the property remained productive. The result was a proliferation of mosques, schools, hospitals, soup kitchens, caravanserais, fountains, and bridges across the empire, built and maintained by the accumulated charitable endowments of generations of donors. The Ottoman city was shaped by this system in ways that reflected a specific understanding of the relationship between private wealth and public benefit. The wealthy were expected to give, and the form of giving was inscribed permanently in the physical fabric of the city. The daily life of an Ottoman city in the 16th or 17th century was organized around rhythms quite different from those of a contemporary European city. The call to prayer, the ezan, sounded 5 times daily from the minarets, organizing the day into its canonical intervals and giving the city a temporal structure that everyone, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, could hear and respond to in their own way. The hammam, the public bathhouse, was a social institution comparable in its cultural function to the Roman bathhouse, a place where people met and talked and conducted informal business alongside the ostensible purpose of washing. The Ottoman hammam tradition produced architectural forms of considerable beauty, the domed bathing halls with their perforated star-shaped openings admitting columns of light that played across the steam-filled interior. The bazaar was the economic heart of the Ottoman city, and the great covered markets of Istanbul, the Grand Bazaar, the Spice Market, were not simply places of commerce, but covered cities within the city, with their own streets and districts and guild organizations. The Grand Bazaar in Istanbul, which traces its origins to a covered market built by Mehmed II shortly after the conquest in 1453, is still the largest covered bazaar in the world and still functions as a commercial center. In the Ottoman period, the bazaar was organized by the guild system, with different trades occupying different streets and sections, the goldsmiths in one area, the cloth merchants in another, the spice dealers in another, each guild maintaining its own standards, its own prices, and its own social solidarity. The coffee house, the kahvehane, was an institution that the Ottomans brought to the world and that changed the social life of every civilization it reached. Coffee arrived in the Ottoman Empire from Yemen in the early 16th century, and coffee houses began appearing in Istanbul and other major cities in the 1550s. They spread with extraordinary speed, becoming the primary gathering place for men of all classes to meet, talk, play games, listen to storytellers and musicians, and hear the latest news. The Ottoman coffee house was not simply a place to drink coffee. It was a civil society institution, a space where public opinion formed, where political discussion occurred, where ideas circulated and relationships formed outside the formal structures of mosque and market and court. From the Ottoman Empire, the coffee house spread to Europe. Coffee houses appeared in Vienna and Amsterdam and London and Paris in the 17th century, carried there by Ottoman trade and Ottoman cultural influence. And they became in European cities the same kind of civil society institution they had been in Ottoman ones. The coffee houses of London that gave rise to insurance at Lloyd's, the coffee houses of Vienna where musical culture flourished, the cafes of Paris where the philosophes gathered, all trace their institutional ancestry to the Ottoman kahvehane. The devshirme system, the periodic levy of Christian boys from the Balkans and other Christian territories, who were converted to Islam, educated in palace schools, and recruited into the elite military and administrative corps of the Janissaries and the higher administrative ranks, was one of the Ottoman Empire's most distinctive and most debated institutions. It was not simply the enslavement of children, though slavery was the legal category within which the devshirme operated. It was a system for identifying and developing talent from the non-Muslim population of the empire, converting it through education and conversion, and using it to staff the most demanding and most prestigious positions in the imperial system. The palace school that received the most promising devshirme boys was one of the empire's most remarkable institutions. Boys taken from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained within the palace could rise to become viziers, governors, commanders, treasurers, and diplomats. To modernize, the coercion at the heart of the system cannot be softened. Families lost sons. Children were removed from their communities. Conversion and service were not freely chosen. At the same time, the system created a channel of social mobility unmatched in most hereditary aristocratic societies of the period. A boy born in a Balkan village could, through the palace machine, become one of the most powerful men in the world. This combination of violence and opportunity is exactly why the Devshirme must be treated carefully. It was not simply benevolent meritocracy, and it was not simply ordinary slavery. It was an imperial technology for breaking old loyalties and creating new ones. The Sultan wanted servants whose advancement depended entirely on him. Men trained from youth to see the dynasty as the source of their identity and fortune. In its strongest period, this produced extraordinary administrators and soldiers. In the long run, it also produced a governing elite whose relationship to the broader society could be tense, distant, and sometimes resented. The Janissaries, the elite infantry corps that formed the core of the Ottoman standing army, were recruited through the Devshirme and trained from childhood in specific military skills and in loyalty to the Sultan. They were among the most effective military forces in the world during the 15th and 16th centuries, disciplined and well-equipped, capable of sustaining the siege operations that the expansion of the empire required. They also became, over time, a political force of considerable power, a military corporation with its own interests and its own capacity to make and unmake sultans, whose support was necessary for any major political change and whose opposition could be fatal. The palace world of Topkapi, the world of the Sultan and his household, the harem and the divan and the treasury and the kitchens, was a world of extraordinary complexity. The harem was not a place of pure pleasure and idleness. It was the private household of the Sultan, organized on strict hierarchical lines, a community of several hundred women who had their own educational system, their own economic arrangements, their own political dynamics, and their own relationship to power that was quite different from the image of passive concubinage that European observers projected onto it. The women of the harem were mostly of slave origin, acquired from the slave markets of the Caucasus and the Black Sea region, educated in the palace, trained in music and embroidery and the skills considered appropriate to palace life. The most capable were educated more intensively and eventually rose in the palace hierarchy. Those who attracted the Sultan's attention and bore him children rose further still. The mother of the Sultan's son acquired the title Hasiki and a position of formal power. If her son eventually came to the throne, she became the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, the most powerful woman in the empire and one of the most politically significant figures at court. The European imagination turned the harem into a fantasy of erotic idleness because that was easier to understand and more profitable to paint than the reality. The harem was a political household. It trained women, managed dynastic reproduction, organized patronage networks, and guarded access to the Sultan. Access was power. A mother, a favorite, a chief eunuch, a tutor, a physician, a wet nurse, all could become links in chains of influence that reached from the private apartments into the divan, the army, the provinces, and foreign diplomacy. Hurrem Sultan changed the rules because she moved from concubine to legal wife and remained permanently at the center of Suleiman's emotional and political life. This was unusual enough to alarm observers. Later, Kozum Sultan and Turhan Sultan would show that the Valide Sultan could become, in moments of weak or young sultans, a ruler in all but name. These women did not possess power because the Ottoman state was soft. They possessed power because dynastic politics made motherhood strategic. In a monarchy, the mother of the future ruler is never merely a private person. The period from approximately 1550 to 1656 is sometimes called the Sultanate of Women, reflecting the genuine political influence that a series of formidable queen mothers exercised during a time when several sultans were young, weak, or disinterested in governance. Hurrem Sultan, a woman of Ruthenian or Ukrainian origin, known in the West as Roxolana, was the most famous of these women. Her influence over Suleiman the Magnificent was sufficiently extraordinary that it was remarked upon by every contemporary observer. She was not merely a favorite, but something closer to a political partner, corresponding with foreign rulers, interceding in political decisions, and managing the harem with an authority that her predecessors had not exercised. The mosque complex she commissioned in Istanbul, the Haseki Sultan complex, remains standing today, built with the resources of a woman who had risen from captivity to become the most influential person in the most powerful empire in the world. The Ottoman Navy, at its height in the 16th century under the great Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, was the dominant naval power in the Mediterranean, contesting control of the sea with Venice and Spain and the other Christian naval powers threatened by Ottoman expansion. Barbarossa, originally a corsair from the island of Lesbos who had built a maritime domain in North Africa before entering Ottoman service, reorganized and expanded the Ottoman fleet, won a major naval victory over a combined Christian fleet at the Battle of Preveza in 1538, and made the Western Mediterranean as much an area of Ottoman ambition as the Eastern. The name Barbarossa, Redbeard, was a nickname that obscured the man's real name, Hayreddin. He became the most celebrated naval commander of the 16th century, feared and respected on both sides of the Mediterranean. The Ottoman defeat at Lepanto in 1571, the Great Sea Battle in the Gulf of Corinth in which a Holy League fleet led by Don John of Austria destroyed the Ottoman fleet, was the first major Ottoman military defeat in living memory, and it sent shockwaves through the Muslim world. But the Ottomans rebuilt their fleet with remarkable speed, demonstrating the empire's enormous resource base. Within 2 years, they had a new fleet larger than the one that had been destroyed, though they never again achieved the same naval dominance of the Mediterranean that Barbarossa's era had produced. The relationship between the Ottoman Empire and the outside world was complex and constantly evolving. The Ottomans were capable of sophisticated diplomacy alongside military aggression, and the specific relationships they maintained with different powers reflected pragmatic calculation as much as religious ideology. The capitulations, the treaties granting special commercial and legal privileges to European merchants trading in Ottoman territory, were not initially concessions extracted from a reluctant empire, but diplomatic instruments the Ottomans used to attract the commercial activity that enriched the imperial economy. Only later, as European commercial power grew, did the capitulations become the instruments of economic penetration that the 19th century reformers agonized over. The alliance between the Ottoman Empire and France, maintained across most of the 16th and 17th centuries, was the most unlikely diplomatic relationship of the early modern period. France and the Ottoman Empire shared an interest in constraining the Habsburg dynasty that dominated Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and much of Italy, and this shared interest overrode the religious difference that most contemporary observers expected to make any Franco-Ottoman alliance impossible. The alliance was never entirely comfortable on either side. French public opinion was often outraged by cooperation with the Muslim Empire, and Ottoman courtiers had reservations about dependence on a Christian ally. But it persisted because it served the interests of both parties, and it demonstrates the extent to which Ottoman foreign policy was driven by rational calculation rather than religious ideology alone. The relationship with the Safavid Empire of Persia, the Shia Muslim dynasty that ruled Iran and Iraq from 1501 onward, was one of the most persistent and most costly conflicts of Ottoman history. The religious dimension was real and consequential. The Sunni Ottoman Empire and the Shia Safavid Empire were theological rivals as well as political ones, and the border between them was also the border between two major traditions within Islam. The Ottomans had significant Shia and Alavi populations within their own territory, particularly in Anatolia, and the Safavid rulers actively cultivated the loyalty of these populations, creating security anxieties that the Ottomans could not ignore. The recurring wars between the two empires, the Calderon Campaign of 1514, the wars of the 1580s, the conflicts of the early 17th century, were enormously expensive and frequently inconclusive, consuming resources that both empires might have deployed more productively. The food culture of the Ottoman Empire was one of the great culinary traditions of the world, and its influence on the food of southeastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa is still immediate and recognizable today. The imperial kitchens of Topkapi employed several hundred cooks organized into specialized departments: pastry cooks, soup cooks, meat cooks, confectioners, pickle makers, preparing food for thousands of people daily. The recipes developed in these kitchens over the centuries became the foundation of the Ottoman culinary tradition, and many of them survive in forms still prepared in the same region today. Ottoman taste was an imperial archive. A dish could carry the memory of Central Asian nomads, Persian court refinement, Arab spice routes, Balkan dairy traditions, Greek maritime foodways, Armenian craftsmanship, and the produce of Anatolian farms. This is why the cuisine of the former Ottoman world is so difficult to assign to one modern nation. Dishes crossed languages and religions long before modern borders attempted to claim them. Baklava, dolma, pilaf, borek, sherbet, kebab, yogurt, coffee, and countless regional sweets and stews belong to a shared historical kitchen shaped by centuries of movement and rule. Food also showed hierarchy. The palace kitchens cooked at a scale that made them a state institution. Ceremonies, festivals, diplomatic receptions, and military payments all involved food. The distribution of baklava to the Janissaries during Ramadan, for example, was not merely dessert. It was ritualized loyalty, a visible link between ruler, army, religion, and generosity. To feed was to govern. To host was to command. To serve coffee was to open a space for conversation that the state sometimes valued and sometimes feared. The baklava, the layered pastry of phyllo dough, nuts, and syrup that is now ubiquitous across the former Ottoman world, appears in the historical record as a specifically Ottoman confection prepared in the imperial kitchens and associated with important court ceremonies. The pilaf, the rice dish prepared in dozens of variations, was a staple of Ottoman court cuisine and is now a staple across the entire former Ottoman world, from the Balkans to the Caucasus to the Arab countries. The meze tradition, the spread of small dishes served before the main meal, reflects the Ottoman practice of elaborate hospitality, in which the variety and abundance of the table communicated the wealth and generosity of the host. And the coffee that the Ottomans brought to the world was consumed alongside these foods, prepared in small copper pots using a method of slow simmering still called Turkish coffee wherever it is made. The tulip, the flower that became synonymous with the Netherlands, was also an Ottoman contribution to the world. Wild tulips from the mountains of Central Asia had been cultivated in Ottoman gardens since at least the 15th century, and the tulip became the emblematic flower of Ottoman garden culture, celebrated in poetry and painting and ceramic art. Ottoman diplomats and merchants brought tulip bulbs to Vienna and from there to the Netherlands in the mid-16th century, where they sparked the famous tulip mania of 1634 to 1637, the speculative bubble in tulip bulb prices that economists have studied ever since as an early example of financial market irrationality. The period of Ottoman cultural history from 1718 to 1730 is actually called the Tulip Era, Lale Devri, reflecting the flower's central place in the aesthetic and social life of early 18th century Istanbul. The Ottoman Empire's engagement with science and learning was more substantial than its popular image in the West suggests. The 16th century in particular saw significant Ottoman contributions to astronomy, geography, medicine, and the natural sciences. The Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis produced a world map in 1513 that is remarkable for its compilation of Atlantic and Mediterranean geographical knowledge from several earlier charts, including Portuguese and Spanish sources. The astronomer Taqi al-Din built an observatory in Istanbul in 1577 with state-of-the-art instruments that were comparable to those of his contemporary Tycho Brahe in Denmark, though the observatory was demolished in 1580 after only 3 years, a victim of religious opposition and political change. The Ottoman Madris system, the Islamic educational institutions attached to mosque complexes, provided basic literacy and religious education across the empire, and the major madrises in Istanbul provided advanced education in religious law, Islamic theology, and the natural sciences, as these were understood within the Islamic tradition. The Madris education was conservative by the 17th century and resistant to the kind of empirical natural philosophy that was developing in Europe, but within its own framework it was serious and systematic, and the scholars it produced maintained a genuine tradition of Islamic learning even as the gap between Ottoman and European scientific development widened. The literary culture of the Ottoman Empire was rich and sophisticated, centered on the Persian literary tradition that the Ottoman court adopted as the prestige language of poetry and belles lettres alongside the Arabic of religious scholarship and the Turkish of administration and oral literature. The great Ottoman poets, Fuzuli, Baki, Nedim, wrote in a highly developed tradition of Persian-influenced verse that used complex formal structures, elaborate images, and a specific vocabulary of love and mysticism that drew on Sufi religious tradition. Baki, the poet laureate of Suleiman's court, wrote a famous elegy on Suleiman's death that is considered a masterpiece of the form and that demonstrates the emotional depth achievable within the apparently rigid conventions of Ottoman court poetry. Ottoman music was another area of high cultural achievement that remains largely unknown outside the tradition. The Ottoman makam system, the system of modal scales and melodic patterns that organized Ottoman classical music, was a sophisticated and complex theoretical framework within which composers and performers worked with a freedom that belies the rigidity that the concept of system might suggest. Ottoman instrumental music, vocal music, and the ceremonial music of the Janissary bands, the Mater, which influenced European military music through direct contact and remains the basis of the military march tradition, all represent genuine artistic achievements within a tradition of great sophistication. The decline of the Ottoman Empire, a process that occupied most of the 18th and 19th centuries, and that the Ottomans themselves were acutely aware of and desperately trying to reverse, was not a simple story of a civilization running down. It was a story of an enormously complex institution struggling to adapt to a world changing faster than it could change itself. The rise of European military and economic power in the 17th and 18th centuries, driven by the scientific revolution, the commercial expansion, the development of new military technologies, and the growth of European overseas empires, created external pressures on the Ottoman system that its traditional responses were inadequate to meet. The word decline can mislead. It suggests a body simply growing old, losing strength because time has passed. But empires do not decline because of age alone. They decline when the systems that once solved problems no longer solve the new problems placed before them. The Ottoman Empire faced artillery revolutions, oceanic trade routes that bypassed older Mediterranean circuits, European fiscal states able to borrow and tax at new scales, nationalist movements among subject peoples, Russian expansion toward the Black Sea and the Balkans, and industrial economies that could produce weapons, cloth, ships, and railways faster and cheaper than older imperial structures. The Ottomans saw these pressures. They were not asleep. Reformers debated, experimented, translated, borrowed, reorganized, and sometimes fought their own institutions to force change. The tragedy was that reform itself became politically dangerous. Modern armies required modern taxation. Modern taxation angered provinces. Legal equality challenged religious hierarchy. Centralization weakened local notables who had long helped the state govern. European-style schools produced officers and bureaucrats who then questioned the Sultan. Every solution opened another problem. The 19th century Ottoman state was not a passive victim of history. It was a state trying to rebuild itself while standing inside an earthquake. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, following the failure of the Second Ottoman Siege of Vienna in 1683, was the first major territorial concession in Ottoman history, the Ottomans surrendering Hungary to the Habsburg Empire and other territories to Venice and Poland. It was the beginning of a long process of military contraction that would continue for more than 2 centuries, as the empire lost territory in the Balkans, in the Caucasus, and eventually in the Arab world to European powers and to the national movements that European ideas of nationalism were stimulating among the diverse peoples of the empire. The Ottoman encounter with Russia became one of the central dramas of the 18th and 19th centuries. Russian rulers wanted access to warm water seas, influence over Orthodox Christians in Ottoman lands, and control over the Black Sea. Each Russian victory exposed Ottoman vulnerability and encouraged European powers to think of the empire as a problem to be managed. This became known in European diplomacy as the Eastern Question. What would happen if the Ottoman Empire weakened further, and which power would inherit its strategic spaces? The answer mattered to everyone. Britain feared Russian access to the Mediterranean and routes toward India. France cared about influence in the Levant and Catholic communities. Austria cared about the Balkans. Russia cared about the Straits, Orthodox protection, and prestige. The Ottomans therefore became both an empire and a diplomatic arena, still sovereign, still dangerous, still capable of reform, but increasingly forced to survive by balancing European powers against one another. Diplomacy became as essential to survival as cavalry had once been. The military reforms of the late 18th and early 19th centuries represented the first systematic Ottoman attempt to address the military technology gap that had opened with Europe. The abolition of the Janissary Corps in 1826 by Sultan Mahmud II, in an event his government called the Auspicious Incident, was among the most dramatic. The Janissaries had been the military backbone of the empire for 4 centuries. But by the early 19th century, they were an obstacle to military modernization, resisting every attempt to introduce European training methods or tactical innovations. Their abolition, carried out by surrounding their barracks with artillery and killing those who resisted, was a bloody event that removed a major institutional obstacle to reform while also destroying a complex social institution with deep roots in the Ottoman system. The Tanzimat reforms of 1839 to 1876, Tanzimat meaning reorganization, represented the most systematic attempt in Ottoman history to modernize the imperial system along European lines. The Tanzimat period saw the promulgation of new legal codes, the establishment of new educational institutions, the creation of a modern civil bureaucracy, the building of telegraph networks and railways, and a series of edicts that formally extended legal equality to all Ottoman subjects regardless of religion. The most important of these edicts, the Hadi-Humayun of 1856, declared the equality of Muslim and non-Muslim subjects before the law, a revolutionary claim that challenged the hierarchical structure of the millet system and was received with very mixed feelings by both Muslim conservatives and by the non-Muslim communities who had learned to value the autonomy they enjoyed within their own communal institutions. The Tanzimat state wanted to create Ottoman citizenship, a shared political identity that could bind Muslims, Christians, and Jews to the same imperial structure. In theory, this was a bold and modern idea. In practice, it was extraordinarily difficult. Many Muslims saw equality for non-Muslims as a loss of rightful status. Many non-Muslim communities welcomed legal protection but feared losing the communal autonomy that had allowed them to manage their own schools, courts, and religious affairs. European powers used the language of minority protection to interfere in Ottoman politics whenever it served their interests. Reform did not remove foreign pressure. It sometimes gave that pressure new vocabulary. The empire also borrowed heavily to finance modernization and war. Railways, armies, bureaucracies, telegraphs, and debt all came together. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration, created in the late 19th century after the state defaulted, gave European creditors direct control over portions of Ottoman revenue. This was not formal colonization, but it was a deep intrusion into sovereignty. A state that had once granted capitulations from a position of strength now found its customs revenues and monopolies entangled with European finance. The empire was modernizing, but often under conditions set by the very powers whose dominance modernization was meant to resist. The constitutional period of 1876, when a parliamentary constitution was promulgated under Sultan Abdulhamid II, represented the politically most advanced experiment in Ottoman government, a genuine attempt to create a constitutional monarchy with an elected parliament representing all communities of the empire. The parliament was suspended by Abdulhamid within 2 years, and he then ruled as an autocrat for 30 years, centralizing power through the telegraph network and the expanded secret police that modern technology made possible. But the constitutional ideal did not disappear. It reappeared in the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, which restored the constitution and ushered in the final phase of Ottoman political life. The Young Turks, the Committee of Union and Progress, represented the generation of Ottoman reformers who had grown up after the Tanzimat, educated in the new schools, who believed the empire could still be saved through radical modernization. They were not wrong in their diagnosis of the problems, but the solutions they attempted were often poorly planned, and the circumstances they faced were nearly impossible. The Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913 cost the empire almost all of its remaining European territory in the space of a few months, a catastrophic loss that shocked the Ottoman population and radicalized Ottoman nationalism in ways that would have terrible consequences. Nationalism was the force the old Ottoman system was least equipped to absorb. The empire had long governed communities as communities, not as modern nations demanding sovereignty. Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Armenians, Arabs, Albanians, and Turks all experienced the 19th century differently, but each was affected by the new idea that a people should have its own state, its own language policy, its own army, its own historical destiny. This idea did not simply liberate. It also hardened identities that had once been overlapping, local, religious, linguistic, and imperial at the same time. The Balkan Wars were therefore more than military defeats. They were demographic and psychological catastrophes. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims fled or were expelled from lands their families had lived in for centuries. Refugees poured into Anatolia and Istanbul, carrying memories of violence and loss. The Ottoman ruling elite became increasingly convinced that the empire's survival required a harder, more centralized, more Turkified state. This atmosphere of fear, loss, and nationalist radicalization formed the immediate background to the disasters of the First World War. The First World War, which the Ottoman leadership entered on the German side in 1914, ended with the British occupation of the Arab provinces, the Greek occupation of parts of western Anatolia, and the empire reduced to its Anatolian heartland. The atrocities committed against the Armenian population during this war, the deportations, the massacres, the death marches into the Syrian desert that killed hundreds of thousands of people, represent the darkest chapter in Ottoman history. The Armenian genocide, recognized as such by most historians and by many governments, was carried out in the context of the war by Ottoman authorities motivated by ethnic nationalism, security anxieties, and the brutal logic of a government willing to use violence against civilian populations it defined as threats. No historical context can justify what was done to the Armenian people during these years. The war also produced the Gallipoli campaign, one of the last great Ottoman military victories and one of the events that made Mustafa Kemal's reputation. Allied forces attempted to force the Dardanelles, open a sea route to Russia, and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The campaign failed after months of brutal fighting on narrow ridges, beaches, trenches, and cliffs. Ottoman soldiers, Anatolian villagers, Arab units, Kurdish units, officers trained in modern military schools, and German advisors all played roles in a defense that became foundational to Turkish national memory. But victory at Gallipoli did not save the empire. The Arab Revolt, British advances through Palestine and Mesopotamia, Russian pressure in the east before the Russian Revolution, famine in Lebanon and Syria, and the catastrophic treatment of Armenians and other Christian populations all tore the imperial structure apart. By the time the armistice came in 1918, the Ottoman Empire was not merely defeated. It was exhausted, discredited, occupied, and internally transformed beyond recovery. The final dissolution of the Ottoman Empire was formalized in the peace treaties following the First World War and in the Turkish War of Independence of 1919 to 1923, in which Mustafa Kemal, later called Ataturk, father of the Turks, led the military resistance to the partition of Anatolia by the Allied powers. The Turkish victory in this war and the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 established the boundaries of the modern Turkish Republic. The Sultanate was abolished in 1922 and the Caliphate in 1924, ending the two institutions that had been central to the Ottoman political and religious identity for 6 centuries. What remained, in the territories of the former Ottoman Empire, was an enormous physical, cultural, and institutional legacy still visible today. The mosque complexes that Sinan and his successors built still dominate the skylines of Istanbul and Edirne and Cairo and Damascus and Jerusalem. The legal codes that the Tanzimat reformers introduced formed the foundation of legal systems in Turkey and in several Arab successor states. The culinary traditions of the Ottoman kitchen, the baklava and the pilaf and the meze and the coffee and the varieties of kebab, are the daily food of hundreds of millions of people across a vast geography. The languages of the region carry Ottoman loanwords in their everyday vocabulary. The administrative boundaries that the Ottoman provincial system established still shape, in many cases, the boundaries of the modern states that emerged from the empire's dissolution. The modern Middle East cannot be understood without the Ottoman ending. The provinces that had once been governed from Istanbul became mandates, protectorates, kingdoms, republics, and nation-states whose borders often reflected wartime diplomacy and European strategic interests as much as local history. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and the Arabian Peninsula all emerged from a post-Ottoman settlement that left deep unresolved questions. In the Balkans, memories of Ottoman rule became part of national narratives, sometimes as oppression, sometimes as coexistence, often as both. In Turkey, the republic built by Ataturk defined itself partly by rejecting the Ottoman imperial and religious order, even while inheriting its bureaucracy, its military geography, and its population shaped by centuries of imperial history. This is why the Ottoman legacy is still politically alive. It is not only architecture or food or music. It is borders, memories, grievances, identities, legal traditions, religious institutions, urban forms, minority questions, and the unresolved relationship between empire and nation. The Ottoman past can be invoked with pride, anger, nostalgia, fear, or scholarly curiosity, depending on who is speaking and from where. A 6th century empire does not vanish cleanly. It leaves layers. The Ottoman legacy is not simple to assess. It never is with long-lived empires. It includes the extraordinary architectural achievements of the classical period and the abuses of the Devshirme system. It includes the genuine practical tolerance of the Millet system and the catastrophic violence of the Armenian genocide. It includes the intellectual achievements of Ottoman scholarship and the institutional rigidity that prevented adequate adaptation to modern challenges. It includes the coffee house and the hammam and the bazaar as contributions to human social life, and the centuries of heavy taxation and periodic misgovernance as costs extracted from the populations it ruled. What is undeniable is the scale and the duration. 600 years. 3 continents. 30 million subjects at the peak. The largest and most durable empire in the history of the Islamic world. A civilization that produced architecture and art and music and literature of enduring quality, that managed the governance of extraordinary diversity with a flexibility that had few parallels in the contemporary world, that contributed to the global spread of coffee and the carpet and the hammam and the tulip. Civilizational gifts that have been used so long and so universally that their origins have been forgotten. The Bosphorus is still there. Istanbul still sits on both sides of it, still the largest city in the former Ottoman world, still carrying in its skyline the minarets and domes that Sinan designed 5 centuries ago. The call to prayer still sounds from those minarets at the 5 canonical hours. The Grand Bazaar still fills its covered streets with vendors and buyers. The Hagia Sophia, converted to a museum in 1934 by Ataturk, reconverted to a mosque in 2020, still stands above the Golden Horn, still the site at which the Byzantine and Ottoman legacies meet in a single building that has outlasted both the empire that built it and the empire that conquered it. 6 centuries. From Osman's small principality in 1299 to the proclamation of the Turkish Republic in 1923. The longest-lived Islamic empire. The last caliphate. The empire whose dissolution shaped the map of the modern Middle East. Still present, in all these ways and many others, in the world we inhabit tonight. The Ottoman Empire was a human achievement, imperfect, sometimes brutal, often extraordinary. It endured because at its best it was flexible enough to incorporate the enormous diversity of the world it governed, because its administrative system found talented men wherever they were born and put them to work, because its legal and religious institutions gave populations of different faiths and origins a stable framework within which to live their lives. The minarets are still there against the Istanbul skyline. The coffee is still being made in small copper pots. The baklava is still being layered in kitchens across the former empire. The 6 centuries are gone, but what they built is still here. One more way to understand Ottoman endurance is to think about roads and messages. An empire of this size could not be held only by charismatic rulers. Orders had to move. Taxes had to be counted. Governors had to know when they were being watched. Military news had to travel from the Danube, the Caucasus, the Arab deserts, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean back toward the capital. Couriers, roads, caravan routes, ports, and later telegraphs were the nervous system of the state. In the early centuries, imperial orders moved through mounted messengers and provincial networks that depended on local cooperation. By the 19th century, the telegraph transformed Ottoman rule. Sultan Abdulhamid II used it with particular intensity, making the empire more centrally visible to the palace than it had ever been before. This was modernization, but it was also surveillance. A technology that could connect provinces to the capital could also make descent more dangerous and central authority more intrusive. The Ottoman relationship with language was equally complex. Ottoman Turkish itself was not the simple spoken Turkish of the street. It was an imperial written language layered with Arabic and Persian vocabulary, capable of great poetic refinement but often difficult for ordinary people. Arabic carried religious authority. Persian carried literary prestige. Greek, Armenian, Ladino, Kurdish, Albanian, Serbian, Bulgarian, Romanian, and many other languages filled the empire's towns, villages, markets, and homes. To govern the Ottoman world was to govern a chorus of languages. Translation was not a minor administrative detail. It was a condition of rule. This linguistic diversity shaped diplomacy as well. Ottoman envoys negotiating with Venice, France, Persia, Poland, Russia, or Britain inhabited a world of interpreters, dragomans, treaties, ceremonial phrases, and carefully managed misunderstanding. The dragomans, many of them from Greek or other Christian families of the empire, became indispensable figures in diplomacy because they knew not only languages but political cultures. They understood how a phrase would sound in one court and how it would be heard in another. In an empire between worlds, interpreters were not servants of history. They were makers of it. The army itself changed across the centuries in ways that reveal the empire's shifting relationship to technology. Early Ottoman cavalry, including the Timurid Sipahis who held land revenues in return for military service, made sense in a world of agrarian taxation and seasonal campaigning. Janissary infantry, artillery, siege engineers, and naval forces made sense in the age of gunpowder empire. Later, European-style drilled infantry, military academies, staff officers, railways, and modern artillery became necessary. Each military form required a different social foundation. To change the army meant changing landholding, taxation, education, promotion, and political power. This is why reform was so difficult. A new uniform was never just a uniform. A new army threatened old privileges. A new school challenged old scholars. A new tax office angered local notables. A new law code unsettled communities that had arranged their lives around older expectations. Modernization sounds simple when described from a distance. Inside a living empire, it was a negotiation with millions of people whose status, income, faith, family memories, and sense of order were tied to the institutions being changed. Even the empire's famous tolerance needs to be understood in this practical way. Ottoman rulers often protected religious communities not because they believed in equality as a modern ideal, but because difference could be governed if it was organized. A patriarch, a chief rabbi, a local bishop, a guild elder, or a communal notable could become a channel through which the state reached a population without administering every individual directly. This made pluralism workable, but it also fixed communities into hierarchies and categories that could become rigid over time. The same system that allowed difference to survive could make equality difficult when modern citizenship arrived. The Ottoman story also forces us to think about memory. To some peoples, Ottoman rule is remembered through architecture, markets, coexistence, and administrative order. To others, it is remembered through conquest, taxation, forced recruitment, repression, and trauma. Both memories can contain truth. Empires are rarely remembered in one voice because they are never experienced in one voice. A merchant in Istanbul, a Serbian monk, an Arab notable in Damascus, a Greek sailor, an Armenian artisan, a Turkish soldier, a Jewish refugee from Spain, and a Kurdish tribal leader did not live inside the same Ottoman reality, even though all lived inside the same imperial structure. This multiplicity is what makes the empire worth telling carefully. It resists simple storytelling. It was not merely East against West, or Islam against Christianity, or tradition against modernity. It was a structure that crossed all those lines and made them unstable. It fought Christian powers and allied with Christian powers. It ruled Muslim subjects and fought Muslim rivals. It adopted European techniques while resisting European domination. It preserved older institutions while creating modern ones. It was always more complicated than the categories imposed on it. To understand the Ottoman Empire as a lived reality, it is useful to leave the palace for a moment and imagine a provincial town. Perhaps it is in Bosnia, or in Anatolia, or in Syria, or in a market center somewhere in Bulgaria. The governor's authority is present, but not omnipresent. The local judge keeps court records. The imam leads prayer. The church bells may sound in a Christian quarter. A Jewish merchant keeps account books in Hebrew letters or Ladino. Guild elders settle disputes among craftsmen. Farmers arrive with grain, wool, animals, and taxes. Soldiers pass through on their way to a campaign. A messenger from the capital brings a decree sealed with the authority of the Sultan. The empire is not only Istanbul. It is this repeated pattern of local life connected to imperial power. The Ottoman court records, the Sicils, are among the richest sources for this world. They preserve property sales, marriage contracts, inheritance disputes, complaints about violence, appointments of guardians, debt settlements, commercial partnerships, WACF documents, and petitions. They show women appearing in court to defend property rights, Christians and Jews using Islamic courts when those courts offered practical advantages, merchants forming partnerships across religious lines, and ordinary people relying on the state not as an abstract empire, but as a set of offices and procedures that could be used. These records complicate every simple picture. The empire was hierarchical, but people navigated it. It was patriarchal, but women acted within it. It was Islamic, but non-Muslims often participated in its institutions. Landholding was one of the foundations of Ottoman military and fiscal order. The Timar system assigned revenue from agricultural land to cavalrymen, who owed military service in return. A Sipahi did not own the land in the modern private sense. He had the right to collect revenue from it, and in exchange he appeared on campaign with arms, horse, and retainers. This system tied provincial revenue to military service and reduced the need for the state to maintain a fully salaried cavalry force. It also connected the empire's expansion to the distribution of reward. Conquest created new revenues. Revenues supported soldiers. Soldiers enabled further conquest. Over time, however, the Timar system became less effective. Warfare changed. Firearms, infantry, artillery, and cash salaries mattered more. Provincial notables accumulated influence. Tax farming expanded, allowing individuals to pay the state for the right to collect taxes from a region. This could provide the treasury with immediate cash, but it also encouraged local exploitation and strengthened men whose interests did not always align with the center. Again, the pattern is familiar in imperial history. A system that solves one generation's problem becomes another generation's burden. The Ottoman Empire was also a world of movement. Pilgrims moved toward Mecca. Merchants moved through Aleppo, Bursa, Cairo, and Istanbul. Soldiers moved toward the Danube or the eastern frontier. Scholars traveled to study with famous teachers. Sufi dervishes moved between lodges. Slaves moved unwillingly through markets and households. Refugees moved when wars or expulsions destroyed older homes. The empire's roads and ports carried faith, language, money, disease, rumors, spices, textiles, manuscripts, and news. To rule such a world required not only walls and armies, but a deep familiarity with circulation. The Hajj was one of the empire's most important annual movements. As the ruler of the holy cities, the Ottoman Sultan had the responsibility of protecting pilgrimage routes and sending the ceremonial caravan from Damascus or Cairo toward Mecca. The departure of the pilgrimage caravan was a major public event, involving officials, guards, camels, gifts, religious banners, and the symbolic presence of the Sultan's authority. Protecting pilgrims across desert routes required diplomacy with tribes, money for supplies, wells, guards, and the careful organization of movement through difficult landscapes. The empire's Islamic legitimacy was renewed each year in the management of this journey. The conquest of the Arab provinces brought the Ottomans into a relationship with older centers of Islamic scholarship and prestige. Cairo, Damascus, Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina were not peripheral cities. They carried histories and religious authority that Istanbul could not simply dominate by decree. Ottoman sultans patronized them, repaired roads and aqueducts, endowed religious institutions, and used their protection of the holy places as a central element of legitimacy. The empire was Turkish in dynasty, Ottoman in political identity, Islamic in imperial vocabulary, and deeply shaped by Arabic-speaking lands whose religious prestige exceeded that of the ruling house itself. The Ottoman treatment of the Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain in 1492 is one of the most often cited examples of Ottoman practical tolerance. Sultan Bayezid II welcomed many of the refugees, recognizing their commercial skills, linguistic networks, medical knowledge, and financial experience. Jewish communities settled in Istanbul, Salonika, Izmir, and other cities, contributing to trade, printing, diplomacy, medicine, and urban culture. Salonika in particular became one of the great Jewish cities of the Mediterranean, with a Ladino-speaking population whose cultural life remained vibrant for centuries. This was not modern equality, but it was refuge at a time when Western Europe was closing doors with lethal force. Armenian communities were also essential to Ottoman urban and commercial life for centuries. Armenian artisans, architects, jewelers, merchants, bankers, and administrators helped shape the empire's economy and built environment. The famous Bulyan family, Armenian architects in the 19th century, designed palaces, mosques, churches, barracks, and public buildings that gave late Ottoman Istanbul much of its visual character, including Dolmabahce Palace. This long record of contribution makes the destruction of the Armenian population during the First World War even more tragic. It was not only the killing of a community defined as suspect in wartime. It was the shattering of one of the empire's own historic peoples. The Greek-speaking Orthodox world occupied a similarly complicated place. After the conquest of Constantinople, the Patriarch became a recognized intermediary between the Ottoman state and Orthodox Christians. Greek merchants and sailors played crucial roles in Black Sea and Mediterranean trade. Phanariot families from the Greek quarter of Istanbul served as dragomans, diplomats, and governors in the Danubian principalities. The Ottoman order gave them opportunities and constraints at the same time. When Greek nationalism emerged in the 19th century, it grew partly from within the very commercial and educational networks the empire had allowed to develop. Ottoman art was not limited to architecture. Calligraphy occupied a privileged place because the written word, especially the Arabic script of the Quran, carried sacred significance. To write beautifully was a religious and artistic act. Ottoman calligraphers developed scripts of extraordinary elegance, and the names of masters were preserved with reverence. A mosque interior might be almost empty of figurative images by comparison with a Christian church, but it was not visually empty. It was filled with geometry, light, tile, carved wood, marble, and writing that turned language itself into ornament. Iznik ceramics were among the great artistic achievements of the empire's classical period. The tiles produced in the town of Iznik, with their brilliant cobalt blue, turquoise, emerald green, and later the famous raised red, decorated mosques, palaces, tombs, and fountains. They used tulips, carnations, hyacinths, sesame leaves, cypress trees, and abstract patterns in compositions that still feel alive. The interior of the Rustam Pasha Mosque in Istanbul is one of the greatest surviving displays of this art. Its surface is covered with tiles so rich that the walls seem to have become a garden of fired color. Ottoman carpets also entered the global visual imagination. European Renaissance painters placed Anatolian carpets in portraits of saints, merchants, and nobles because the carpets signaled wealth, refinement, and contact with the Eastern Mediterranean. Some carpet types are now named after the European painters who depicted them, such as Holbein and Lotto carpets, even though they were woven in Anatolia. This is one of the quiet ironies of art history. Ottoman and Anatolian textiles became part of European painting's language of prestige, while later viewers sometimes forgot where that prestige came from. The palace kitchens were supported by a supply system that reached across the empire. Rice, sugar, spices, honey, sheep, poultry, fruit, coffee, fish, oil, and flour moved through regulated channels toward Istanbul. Feeding the palace was not only a culinary matter, it was an administrative achievement. The kitchens of Topkapi were among the largest in the world, with separate areas for the sultan, the harem, the pages, the officials, and the broader palace community. Food expressed rank. What one ate, when one ate, and who served it all communicated position inside the imperial order. Ceremony mattered because the empire was performed as well as governed. The accession of a sultan, the girding with the sword of Osman, the procession to Friday prayer, the reception of ambassadors, the departure of an army, the celebration of princely circumcisions, the distribution of robes of honor, the presentation of petitions, all were carefully choreographed. To witness Ottoman ceremony was to see hierarchy made visible. The sultan might be physically distant, screened by ritual and protocol, but that distance was itself part of power. The ruler was not meant to seem ordinary. Ambassadors who came to Istanbul often described the experience with awe, irritation, and anxiety. They waited, negotiated protocol, offered gifts, received robes, and stood in ceremonial spaces designed to communicate the empire's superiority. European envoys sometimes complained that the Ottomans treated them as petitioners rather than equals. From the Ottoman perspective, this was precisely the point. Diplomatic ceremony reflected an older imperial worldview in which the sultan stood at the center and foreign rulers appeared as powers to be managed, ranked, and received according to their usefulness and status. The printing press entered the Ottoman world slowly and unevenly. Jewish communities used Hebrew printing in the empire from the late 15th century. Armenian and Greek presses appeared later. Muslim printing in Ottoman Turkish faced greater resistance, partly because of concern for scribal professions, partly because religious texts required careful handling, and partly because manuscript culture remained prestigious. Ibrahim Mutafarrika, a Hungarian convert to Islam, established one of the first official Ottoman Turkish presses in the 18th century. The delay in widespread printing has often been cited as one reason for the growing intellectual gap with Europe, though the issue was more complex than a simple refusal of technology. The tulip era of the early 18th century was a moment when Ottoman elites experimented with pleasure, display, diplomacy, and selective European influence. Gardens, fountains, poetry, night festivals, and tulip cultivation became symbols of elite culture. Embassies to Europe brought back reports of French architecture, military organization, printing, and social life. This period is sometimes caricatured as decadence before decline, but it can also be seen as a moment of cultural curiosity, when Ottoman elites knew the world was changing and began looking outward in new ways. Its end came with the Patrona Halil Revolt in 1730, a reminder that elite reform and pleasure could provoke violent reaction from those who felt excluded or threatened. Egypt under Muhammad Ali in the early 19th century posed one of the greatest internal challenges the empire ever faced. Muhammad Ali, an Albanian Ottoman officer who became governor of Egypt, built a semi-independent state with a modern army, new industries, and aggressive ambitions. His forces conquered Sudan, challenged Ottoman authority in Syria, and at one point threatened Anatolia itself. The central government in Istanbul survived only because European powers intervened to prevent Egypt from replacing the Ottoman dynasty as the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. This crisis revealed the empire's weakness, but also its importance. Europe still preferred a weakened Ottoman Empire to a powerful alternative that might unsettle the balance of power. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 brought Britain and France into alliance with the Ottoman Empire against Russia. On paper, this looked like diplomatic success. The empire had powerful allies. Russia was checked. The Treaty of Paris recognized Ottoman territorial integrity. But the war also exposed the empire to deeper European involvement, greater debt, and the reality that its survival now depended partly on the calculations of powers that did not love it but needed it. The Ottoman state had become indispensable to European balance, which meant that everyone wanted it preserved and manipulated at the same time. Railways changed the imperial imagination. A railway could move soldiers, pilgrims, grain, officials, and ideas faster than caravans and roads had allowed. The Hejaz Railway, begun under Abdulhamid II, was intended to connect Damascus with Medina and ultimately Mecca, strengthening the Sultan Caliph's authority over the pilgrimage and the Arab provinces. It was funded partly by donations from Muslims around the world, making it both an infrastructure project and a symbol of pan-Islamic solidarity. The line never fully achieved all its ambitions, but its meaning was powerful. Modern technology in the service of Islamic imperial legitimacy. Abdulhamid II is one of the most controversial figures in Ottoman history. To some, he was an autocrat who suspended parliament, censored the press, used spies, and ruled through fear. To others, he was a shrewd survivor who held the empire together during a period of impossible pressure, investing in railways, schools, telegraphs, and pan-Islamic diplomacy while European powers waited for further weakness. Both readings contain truth. He understood modern tools and used them to strengthen personal rule. He modernized and repressed at the same time, which is one reason his reign is so difficult to reduce to a single judgment. The empire's final generation was educated in schools that the reforming state had created. Military academies, medical schools, administrative colleges, and new secondary schools produced officers and officials who were more modern, more literate in European political ideas, and often more impatient than their predecessors. The state trained the men who would challenge it. This is another recurring pattern of modernization. A government builds schools to strengthen itself, and those schools create people capable of imagining a different political order. The Committee of Union and Progress emerged from this world of officers, bureaucrats, conspirators, and exiles. They wanted constitutional government, stronger central authority, military modernization, and the rescue of the empire from foreign domination and internal fragmentation. They spoke the language of liberty and progress, but under wartime pressure many moved toward authoritarian nationalism. Their story is a warning about reform movements in collapsing empires. Fear can transform constitutional hopes into coercive projects, especially when leaders become convinced that survival leaves no room for pluralism. When the Ottoman Empire finally ended, it did not end with a single clean collapse. The Sultanate was abolished in 1922. The Republic was proclaimed in 1923. The Caliphate was abolished in 1924. Each date marked the severing of a different thread, dynastic sovereignty, imperial statehood, religious political authority. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and his allies built the Turkish Republic on a radical rejection of many Ottoman institutions, including the caliphate, religious courts, old dress codes, and the Arabic script. Yet the Republic inherited Ottoman officers, Ottoman bureaucratic habits, Ottoman Anatolia, and Ottoman problems of memory. The emotional afterlife of the empire is still visible in Istanbul. A person can walk from the walls of Theodosius to the Suleimani, from the Grand Bazaar to the Egyptian Bazaar, from Topkapi to Dolmabahce, from Byzantine cisterns to Ottoman mosques to Republican avenues. No single layer erases the others. The city is not a museum of one empire. It is an argument between empires, faiths, styles, languages, and memories, all built into stone, water, and street life. This layered quality is perhaps the most fitting image for the Ottoman past. It is not a vanished world sealed behind glass. It is a past still embedded in living places, still shaping how people cook, pray, remember, argue, build, and name themselves. The empire's greatest monuments were built by sultans and architects, but its deeper legacy was made by millions of ordinary lives that crossed its roads and filled its markets for 600 years. Sufi orders were another connective tissue of the Ottoman world. The empire was not governed only through formal mosques and judges. It was also shaped by lodges, sheikhs, saints' tombs, devotional music, initiation, charity, and networks of spiritual authority. The Mevlevi order, associated with the legacy of Jalal al-Din Rumi, cultivated poetry, music, and the famous turning ceremony that later observers called the dance of the whirling dervishes. The Bektashi order had deep connections with the Janissaries and with popular religious life in Anatolia and the Balkans. These orders could support the state, soften the frontier, teach, feed, heal, and create loyalty in places where formal administration was thin. At the same time, Sufi orders could also become centers of resistance or alternative authority. A sheikh with followers, land, reputation, and spiritual prestige was not merely a private mystic. He could influence tribes, villages, soldiers, and urban craftsmen. The Ottoman state therefore had to manage religious charisma carefully. It patronized some orders, watched others, suppressed movements it considered dangerous, and used spiritual networks when they helped stabilize frontier regions. The religious life of the empire was not a quiet background to politics. It was part of politics. The Balkans under Ottoman rule developed a distinctive urban culture visible in bridges, mosques, baths, markets, clock towers, and caravanserais. Cities such as Sarajevo, Skopje, Plovdiv, Thessaloniki, and Mostar became Ottoman cities without ceasing to be Balkan ones. The bridge at Mostar, built in the 16th century by Mimar Hayreddin, a student of Sinan, became one of the most elegant Ottoman structures in Europe, a single stone arch spanning the Neretva River with a lightness that still seems almost improbable. Its destruction in the Bosnian War of the 1990s and later reconstruction show how Ottoman monuments can remain emotionally and politically charged centuries after the empire is gone. In Arab cities, Ottoman rule took different forms. Damascus remained a city of pilgrimage, scholarship, commerce, and old prestige. Cairo was too large, wealthy, and self-confident to become merely a provincial town. Baghdad, repeatedly contested between Ottomans and Safavids, carried the memory of the Abbasid Caliphate even after centuries of political change. Ottoman governors in these cities had to negotiate with local scholars, urban notables, merchants, tribal groups, and religious endowments. The empire's strength lay partly in knowing when to command and when to bargain. North Africa formed yet another Ottoman world. Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli were connected to Istanbul, but often governed with considerable local autonomy. shaped by corsair warfare, Mediterranean slavery, trade, and competition with Spain, France, and Italian states. The rulers of these provinces acknowledged Ottoman sovereignty, used Ottoman titles, and benefited from imperial connection, but their daily politics were often driven by local military households and maritime interests. This loose imperial structure allowed the Ottomans to project influence far west across the Mediterranean without administering every coastline directly from Istanbul. Slavery existed throughout the Ottoman world in several forms, and it must be included honestly. Household slavery, military slavery, concubinage, palace training, agricultural servitude in some regions, and the slave trade from the Black Sea, Caucasus, Africa, and elsewhere were all part of the imperial system. Some enslaved people rose to extraordinary power, especially in palace and military contexts. Many others lived and died in dependency, exploitation, and anonymity. The fact that Ottoman slavery differed in structure from the plantation slavery of the Atlantic world does not make it harmless. It was a system of ownership over human beings, and it shaped homes, armies, courts, and the palace itself. The Janissary band, the mater, changed the sound of power. Drums, kettle drums, cymbals, horns, and piercing reed instruments accompanied military movement and ceremony with a force that European observers found both terrifying and fascinating. Ottoman military music influenced European composers and the development of military bands across the continent. Mozart, Beethoven, and other composers used what they thought of as Turkish sounds, percussion, bright rhythms, and martial energy to evoke the Ottoman world on European stages. Even in music, the encounter between Ottoman and European culture left traces that outlived the battlefield. Ottoman time was also marked by the lunar calendar, religious festivals, market days, and imperial ceremonies. Ramadan changed the rhythm of cities, with fasting by day and social life after sunset. Eid celebrations brought public prayer, visits, sweets, new clothes, and the display of generosity. The departure of a campaign created its own atmosphere. Workshops producing supplies, families saying farewell, officials counting equipment, and the city watching the army pass out through gates toward another frontier. Empires are made of such rhythms, repeated until they feel permanent. The empire's relationship to Europe was never simply one of opposition. European merchants lived in Ottoman ports. Ottoman textiles and ceramics entered European homes. European clocks, weapons, maps, books, and fashions entered Ottoman elite circles. Captives converted in both directions. Diplomats learned each other's ceremonies. Borderlands in Hungary, Croatia, Bosnia, and the Black Sea became zones of exchange as much as conflict. The idea of a sealed Christian Europe facing a sealed Muslim East is a later simplification. The real frontier was porous, violent, commercial, multilingual, and constantly negotiated. The Ottoman court also used visual restraint as a form of authority. Unlike European monarchs who filled palaces with portraits of themselves, Ottoman sultans were often represented through calligraphy, insignia, architecture, and ceremony rather than through constant public images of the face. The tugra, the sultan's calligraphic signature, appeared on decrees and documents as a visual embodiment of sovereignty. It was not merely a name. It was a graphic symbol of command, instantly recognizable, elegant, and political. In a culture of writing, the ruler's stylized name could be as powerful as a portrait. The move from Topkapi Palace to Dolmabahce Palace in the 19th century says much about the empire's transformation. Topkapi was inward-facing, layered, ceremonial, and pre-modern in its spatial logic. Dolmabahce, built on the Bosphorus in a European-influenced style, with grand staircases, crystal chandeliers, enormous halls, and a facade meant to be seen from the water, expressed a different ambition: to appear modern, wealthy, and equal to European monarchies. It was beautiful, but also financially costly, built by a state already under serious fiscal pressure. Architecture had become part of diplomatic performance. Education reform created a new Ottoman public. Newspapers, journals, translations, military textbooks, novels, and political pamphlets circulated in the 19th century in ways that earlier manuscript culture could not have supported. Ottoman intellectuals debated constitutionalism, Islam, science, nationalism, women's education, bureaucracy, Europe, and the meaning of progress. Some wanted to save the empire by creating a shared Ottoman patriotism. Others moved toward Turkish, Arab, Armenian, Greek, or other national visions. The printed word made politics faster and harder to control. Women in the late Ottoman world also entered public debate in new ways. Girls' schools expanded. Women's journals appeared. Writers argued about education, marriage, domestic life, work, and the role of women in a modern society. This did not erase patriarchy, but it changed the conversation. The earlier power of imperial women had been dynastic and courtly. The late Ottoman discussion of women was social and national. What kind of mothers, citizens, teachers, and writers would a modern community need? The question belonged to the wider crisis of reform. The Ottoman Empire's final decades were therefore not only a story of armies and treaties. They were a story of people trying to decide what kind of future could still be imagined. Could a Muslim dynasty rule equal citizens of many religions? Could a caliphate be constitutional? Could an empire become a nation without destroying the peoples who did not fit the new definition? Could Islamic law, European codes, local custom, and modern bureaucracy coexist? Could loyalty to the Sultan, to religion, to language, to province, and to nation be held together? These questions were not abstract. They determined life and death. When the empire died, many of its people did not experience the end as liberation alone or catastrophe alone. Some experienced both. A Greek nationalist might see freedom from Ottoman rule. A Muslim refugee from the Balkans might see loss and expulsion. An Arab reformer might see opportunity and disappointment. An Armenian survivor might see the ruins of a destroyed world. A Turkish Republican might see the necessary birth of a new nation from imperial wreckage. The same historical ending produced different moral landscapes for different communities. This is why a strong account of the Ottoman Empire must refuse the comfort of a single emotion. Wonder is appropriate before Sinan's domes. Admiration is appropriate before the administrative endurance of the state. Unease is appropriate before the Devshirme and slavery. Horror is appropriate before genocide. Curiosity is appropriate before the coffee house, the bazaar, the court record, the music, the tile, the legal code. The empire asks for a mature historical response, not a slogan. And perhaps that is the best reason to tell its story slowly. The Ottoman Empire forces us to think about how civilizations hold difference together, how power uses beauty, how law can both protect and subordinate, how reform can arrive too late, how memory outlives sovereignty, and how a state born on a frontier can shape half the world for 600 years. It is not distant. Its consequences are still around us. The empire's provincial elites were another reason Ottoman power lasted as long as it did. Istanbul could command, but it could not personally supervise every valley, port, tribe, monastery, market, and tax district from Hungary to Yemen. Local notables, called ayin in many regions, became intermediaries between the central state and provincial society. They collected taxes, supplied troops, mediated disputes, and sometimes resisted the capital when their interests were threatened. In the 18th century especially, these notables became powerful enough that the empire looked less like a perfectly centralized machine and more like a negotiated order held together by habit, fear, mutual advantage, and imperial legitimacy. This negotiated character did not mean the state was weak in every sense. It meant Ottoman sovereignty often operated through layers. A village headman answered to a district authority. A district authority answered to a provincial governor. Religious leaders answered to their own hierarchies and to the state. Guilds regulated labor while also serving the tax system. Tribal leaders might be paid, threatened, or recognized depending on circumstances. The empire's genius was often not direct control, but structured compromise. Its danger was that such compromise could become fragmentation when the center no longer had enough military or financial strength to discipline the local powers it depended on. The Ottoman imagination of justice centered on an old political idea, sometimes called the circle of justice. A ruler needed soldiers to protect the realm. Soldiers needed money. Money came from taxpayers. Taxpayers could produce wealth only if protected by justice. Justice therefore sustained revenue. Revenue sustained the army sustained the ruler, and the ruler was obligated to maintain justice. This circular idea appeared in many Islamic and Persianate political traditions and shaped Ottoman advice literature. It was not democracy, it was not equality, but it was a theory of responsible rule, and Ottoman sultans were repeatedly judged in their own political culture by whether they preserved the balance that allowed the circle to function. That is why misgovernment mattered morally as well as practically. Excessive taxation was not simply inefficient. It was unjust. A corrupt governor did not merely annoy the local population. He threatened the order that made sovereignty legitimate. Petitions to the Sultan often used this language, presenting the ruler as the final source of justice against abusive officials. Whether the petitioners always received justice is another question, but the existence of the language matters. Ottoman subjects knew how the state claimed to justify itself, and they could use those claims when asking for protection. The imperial capital consumed more than food and taxes. It consumed imagination. For people in distant provinces, Istanbul was not merely a city. It was the place where power became visible, where appointments were made, where fortunes rose and fell, where the Sultan's household lived behind walls and ceremonial gates. A young man selected for palace service, a merchant seeking a license, a scholar hoping for appointment, an ambassador carrying gifts, a provincial notable seeking confirmation of privilege, all oriented themselves toward the capital. Istanbul was the center not because it was geographically central, but because careers, legitimacy, and status flowed through it. Yet the Ottoman Empire was never only centralized. Its strength lay precisely in the tension between center and locality. Too much local autonomy could fracture the empire. Too much central pressure could provoke revolt. The art of Ottoman rule was the management of that tension. At its best, the system could absorb difference without dissolving. At its worst, it could suppress difference without resolving it. Over 6 centuries, the balance shifted again and again. The empire also shows how military success can create administrative problems. Every conquest adds land, people, languages, roads, enemies, obligations, and expectations. Expansion brings revenue, but it also brings borders to defend. The Ottoman Empire at its height had to watch the Habsburgs in Central Europe, the Safavids and later Qajars in Iran, the Russians in the north, Venice and Spain at sea, tribal politics in Arabia, Mamluk memories in Egypt, and local discontent everywhere. The map looked magnificent, but magnificence is expensive. The larger the empire became, the more coordination it required. For this reason, the Ottoman achievement should be measured not only by the territories conquered, but by the centuries those territories were held together. Conquest can be sudden. Governance is repetitive. A victory might take a day. A province must be administered every season. Taxes must be collected without destroying the taxpayers. Armies must be supplied without emptying the countryside. Religious communities must be managed without constant revolt. Roads must be kept safe enough for trade. Judges must appear legitimate enough that people use the courts. The ordinary repetition of rule is less dramatic than battle, but it is the real test of empire. This is also why the Ottoman decline, when it came, was so painful. The empire's rulers were not watching a simple collapse from a distance. They were watching systems that had worked for centuries become insufficient. The army that had once terrified Europe needed European instructors. The tax system that had funded conquest needed foreign loans. The legal hierarchy that had organized religious difference now faced demands for equality. The idea of imperial subjecthood now competed with the idea of nationhood. Every old success had to be rethought, and not every institution could survive the rethinking. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire had become a world of overlapping endings. The Balkan Muslim refugees arriving in Anatolia were living one ending. Armenian communities facing deportation and massacre were living another. Arab officers debating decentralization or independence were living another. Young Turkish officers dreaming of national survival were living another. The Sultan Caliph trying to preserve religious legitimacy was living another. Europe saw the sick man of Europe. The people inside the empire saw homes, graves, languages, schools, and futures at risk. This human scale is important because empires are often discussed as if they are maps. But a map does not show the kitchen where a family hears that the army is mobilizing. It does not show the apprentice in a guild, the woman taking a petition to court, the soldier walking from an Anatolian village toward Gallipoli, the Armenian mother forced onto a deportation road, the Greek merchant deciding whether to leave, the Arab notable calculating what British promises mean, the Jewish family remembering Spain and belonging to Salonika, the bureaucrat in Istanbul drafting reforms he knows may not be enough. History becomes clearer when the map is filled with people. The Ottoman Empire deserves a strong place in any history of the modern world because it stood at the hinge of so many transformations. It connected medieval and modern, Europe and Asia, Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, Islamic law and European codes, palace slavery and bureaucratic schooling, empire and nation-state. Its collapse helped shape the First World War settlement, the Turkish Republic, the Arab Middle East, Balkan politics, minority questions, and the continuing symbolic power of Istanbul. The empire ended, but the problems it managed did not end with it. The Ottoman Empire was never one thing only. It was a frontier state and a world empire. It was a Muslim dynasty ruling Christian and Jewish communities. It was a military machine and a legal order. It was a palace civilization and a village tax system. It produced beauty, discipline, scholarship, architecture, music, coffee houses, kitchens, courts, and armies. It also produced coercion, hierarchy, repression, massacres, and the final violence of a state collapsing under the pressure of war and nationalism. To tell its story honestly is to hold all of this at once. The empire cannot be reduced to nostalgia, and it cannot be reduced to condemnation. It was too large for either. 6 centuries of human life passed through its institutions. Children taken into palace schools, merchants counting coins in covered bazaars, mothers drawing water at fountains endowed by imperial women, judges writing decisions in provincial towns, Janissaries marching to drums, Greek priests negotiating community privileges, Armenian artisans working metal and stone, Arab scholars teaching in madrasis, Balkan peasants paying taxes, sailors watching the Bosphorus currents, architects calculating the weight of domes, reformers reading French political thought, refugees arriving with nothing, and soldiers dying in trenches in the empire's final war. The Ottoman world is gone as a political order, but it remains visible because the deepest empires do not survive only in flags and thrones. They survive in cities, recipes, musical modes, legal habits, religious institutions, family memories, street names, roof lines, and unresolved arguments. Istanbul still carries its layered skyline. The Bosphorus still divides and joins Europe and Asia. The domes still rise above the water. Coffee is still poured into small cups. The bazaars still echo. The stones of old mosques still hold the hands that shaped them. From Osman's small frontier principality to the republic that replaced the Sultanate, the Ottoman story is a story of endurance and transformation on a scale few states have ever matched. It began at the edge of older empires and became one of the centers of world history. It ruled, adapted, built, fought, reformed, failed, and left behind a world that cannot be understood without it. The empire's most enduring lesson may be that durability is never passive. Nothing in the Ottoman story lasted simply because it was old. It lasted because people repaired it, argued over it, extracted from it, believed in it, feared it, benefited from it, resisted it, and remade it again and again. Every century added pressure. Every century forced choices. Some choices strengthened the state. Some delayed necessary change. Some created beauty. Some caused suffering. But the empire remained historically alive for so long because it never existed as a frozen relic. It was always being negotiated. Sleep well. Good night.